Love what you create. Yarn choice. The yarn you choose is going to have a very large effect on the finished fabric that you create when you knit or crochet. So it's important to keep that in mind when you are choosing your yarn. Drape is basically how a fabric moves. If it's really stiff, maybe you're making some sort of a container or basket and you want that to be stiff so that it holds its shape. Or if it's really, really flowing, you want to have a nice little skirt or a shawl that flows in the wind. That's all the drape of your fabric. The drape of your fabric can be affected by the fibers and the production method of your yarn. So, for example, when made with the right production method, something like silk can be incredibly flowing. And depending on the production method, something like acrylic can be very, very stiff. If you want your finished fabric to have a lot of flow and a lot of movement, you're going to want to start with a softer yarn. If you want your finished fabric to hold where you put it, then you're going to want a stiffer yarn. And of course, if you want your finished item to look like the designer's sample, if you're making something from a pre-existing design, then you want to use the same yarn that the designer used. Wash. The wash and care method that you used for your finished item can significantly change that finished item. Sometimes things will shrink. Sometimes things will actually grow. Some will felt. Some will get really pilly. Some will just turn into a mess depending on what stitch you used. There are so many variables, not only because of the yarn content and the method it was made, but also in the way that you wash an item. All of that, you put it together, and if you haven't planned out your washing ahead of time, things can go quite astray once you actually wash something. The best way to avoid things going astray would be to swatch and test. So unless you're using a yarn that you already know the care method, you know nothing's going to change, or maybe you're making something that isn't going to have a care method, you're making some sort of wall decor or something like that, and it's never going to get washed, so you don't really care. That's fine. But especially if it's something fitted or something where the flow of the fabric matters, then you really need to make sure that you have pre-tested your washing method. And the best way to do that is just to make several little swatches using the yarn, the hook or needle, and the stitch pattern that you are planning on using. Make a few different swatches, keep one exactly just unwashed and untouched, and then with the others, try washing them a couple ways. And then once they're all washed and dried, look at them, compare them, and see what happens. Now, once you know what happens, then you are able to start making your finished item. Keep in mind that if with your care method, your swatch shrunk or grew, that will affect your finished item. You want to make sure you're making your finished item to the size it needs to be after it's washed. Okay, so sometimes this requires a little bit of math, a little bit of planning ahead, but these are the kind of things that are going to bring your creations from something that I was able to wear once and then I washed it and I couldn't wear it anymore to something that has a long lifetime of love. You want to share the care. You want to share your care method. So what that means is if you're writing the pattern and there's a specific care method that you suggest, go ahead and put it in there. If you have made something that you are selling or giving to somebody else, then take a moment to put that care method on a little index card or something. You'll want to write on the index card what the item is and what the care method is. And then that way they have that and they can keep it and they'll always remember how to take care of that item. And if they don't, as much as it stinks, at least it's not your fault. Texture. Not all yarn is equal in so many ways. One of those ways is the texture. Some yarns are fuzzy or furry. We've all seen the furry yarn. Some of them are nubby, some are soft, some are scratchy. A lot of times that texture is a part of the yarn that is supposed to be there. The scratchy ones, not so much, but the ones that have like little, nubs on them and the ones that have kind of like a little halo, a lot of those things are supposed to be there. But that texture obviously is going to affect your finished item. The finished look of your item is going to be affected by what yarn you use. There's a big difference between something made out of a fuzzy yarn and something made out of a really flat yarn with not a single fiber out of place, just completely smooth. That's going to be a completely different look. They both have their place, but they are different looks, and you need to keep that in mind when you're choosing your yarn. Make sure you get the texture that is going to give you the finished look you want. Textures will also affect the drape of your yarn. If you're unsure if the texture is going to affect the specific drape that you want, then I know that a lot of people don't like the word swatch, but you're going to have to swatch. Test it out, see, because some textures just don't move the same way as others. Of course, the feel is going to be so much different. And this is incredibly important when you're talking about wearable items, and especially when you're talking about something like hats and scarves that are worn directly against the skin and close to or on the face, because people's faces tend to be very sensitive to different textures. You want to feel your yarn. Feel your yarn. See what it's going to feel like when it's still in the skein or ball form. But then once you've made a little bit, once you've made your swatch or whatever, then feel that again. Take your swatch and rub it on your arm, on your cheek. Try touching it in different places and seeing how it feels. And if it feels uncomfortable, then that's an important thing to know. Feel may not be such a big deal if you're making something that's not worn, but everything in this lesson is going to matter a little bit more or a little bit less, depending on what your finished item is going to be. So there you go, a nice little overview of how your yarn choice can affect your finished item.